Hello and welcome. My name is Mandy Young, and I'm a manager in the Special Education Special Projects Division at TEA. Over the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be discussing guidance related to progress monitoring during remote learning. We will begin by reviewing our True North Statement for the Office of Special Populations Monitoring. Together, we are committed to high expectations and strong systems that achieve equitable outcomes for every student with a disability. Before we start this training, we want to remind everyone that in planning for potential need for remote delivery of educational services, including special education and related services, local education agencies, or LEAs, must ensure FAPE to students with disabilities and implement the requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and state law. LEAs and school staff want to prioritize decisions and actions based on health and safety first, to include communication with staff and families. During this guidance on progress monitoring, there are 3 objectives we will address. It is important to remember that during remote learning, progress monitoring must continue. Our objectives for this presentation is to identify the focus of progress monitoring, determine the best practices for progress monitoring, and review appropriate progress monitoring tools and methods during remote learning. This professional development was created for district special education leadership, campus-based special education leadership, school administrators, and special education direct instruction staff in mind. This guidance is specifically written for special education leadership in Texas schools to provide progress monitoring guidelines during unexpected shifts from face-to-face education to remote learning or other unexpected emergencies. The U.S. Department of Education explains that progress monitoring is a scientifically based practice that is used to assess students' academic performance and evaluate the effectiveness of instruction. Progress monitoring can be implemented with individual students or an entire class. So, are there differences in progress monitoring during remote learning as opposed to face-to-face or in-person progress monitoring? To answer this question, let's talk more about what makes up progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is made up of several components. These components can be identified by 4 different areas. The first component we will discuss is efficacy of instruction, or the ability to produce a desired or intended result through instruction. Then we will move to measuring progress. This means using the IEP, which has established concrete criteria for measuring progress toward the attainment of each goal that is set for a student with a disability. Instructional change is identifying through data what instruction is not successful in helping the student succeed, and then making instructional changes. It's important to document these appropriate changes in an IEP. And finally, feedback. We're using formative assessment, questioning, and observation to gather data and provide accurate feedback to parents and the ARD committees. So let's take a close look at each of these components. The first area to dive into is efficacy of instruction. Progress monitoring provides the documentation and data needed to monitor the impact of instruction. Progress monitoring will allow us to observe and evaluate the effectiveness of methods of instruction delivery. In order to evaluate efficacy of instruction for student learning, we must measure the effectiveness of certain delivery methods. This might include things like visual aids, lecture, guided projects, instruction during small and whole groups, as well as individual instruction. For example, if a student has performed poorly on a concept that was taught via virtual lecture, we may assume that lecturing has low efficacy and a different delivery method needs to be evaluated. An IEP may already provide accommodations for a student that can be delivered in a virtual or remote setting. It is essential to measure how these accommodations or modifications are impacting the student's success. Individualized differentiation delivery methods are based on the success of each student with a disability. The effectiveness of these methods used need to be measured and changes considered on a continuous basis, as well as updated in the student's IEP. So this slide highlights the efficacy of instructional methods, but specifically during remote learning. During remote learning, instructional delivery methods are compromised or sometimes not even possible. During traditional learning, instruction occurs face-to-face, be highly interactive. Teachers have capabilities to switch from whole group to one-on-one instruction at an easier pace than while delivering instruction remotely. An important question to ask is, how will you monitor the effectiveness of instruction during remote learning? The student's IEP should guide teachers to implement instruction with fidelity using the accommodations and modifications written in the IEP. If the IEP needs to be altered due to a change in the type of instruction, it's necessary to monitor the effectiveness of this new instruction and collect data. The student's IEP may or may not need to be updated to include these instructional delivery methods. It just depends on the language of the current IEP, accommodations, modifications, goals, and objectives listed in the student's IEP. The delivery method may change from face-to-face to remote instruction, and even though the instruction delivery is altered, progress monitoring still allows us to gauge the efficacy of the instruction. The next area we will visit is measuring progress. Progress monitoring provides the tracking and data needed to measure student progress toward goal attainment in all areas that were identified in a student's IEP. Measuring progress provides documentation of teacher effort in providing the instruction and interventions required per the IEP. It also provides documentation of the implementation and effectiveness of identified accommodations and modifications. This next slide highlights measuring progress, but specifically during remote learning. When measuring progress, there's no difference between remote and face-to-face instruction. Progress toward annual goals must be measured and reported during remote learning. LEAs must make reasonable efforts to continue measuring student progress toward the annual IEP goals as specified in the student's IEP. LEAs must report this progress at least as often as parents of non-disabled students are informed of their progress. The third area is instructional change. So first we measured the efficacy of instruction, then we measured progress, and now we will want to identify what is working or not working to help the student succeed through data. This data guides our decisions on instructional changes. Progress monitoring allows us to measure the efficacy of instruction, which assists in determining any changes needed in the method of instruction delivery. So, for example, upon reviewing progress monitoring documentation, we identify that student A is not making progress towards his math goal. Lesson plan reviews show that the concept was taught using virtual lecture and in practice. We now know that this method may not be effective for student A. Using data, we may identify that the inclusion of hands-on or visuals in our instruction will assist the students to succeed. Progress monitoring through instructional change also helps the ARD committee to identify what accommodations or modifications may need to be changed to help the student succeed. There may be a student that doesn't respond to remote instruction. We may need to change from virtual conferencing to telephone instruction, or from small group virtual delivery to individual virtual delivery. These are the types of instructional changes that progress monitoring will allow us to identify. It is imperative that data and documentation of this data is used to drive instructional changes in the IEP. So this highlights instructional change, but specifically during remote learning. Again, there's no difference between progress monitoring and remote and face-to-face instruction when evaluating instructional change. The process for progress monitoring in both face-to-face and remote learning is the same. However, the method may be different. Progress monitoring can help us gauge the effectiveness of instructional change during remote learning. It is important to ask, what instruction is working? Students should be making progress if the instructional change is effective. If students are not making progress in a remote learning environment, ARD committees must ask what other options are available. An ARD committee must be convened and other options discussed for instructional change if a student is not making progress. So, for example, if virtual lecturing, either recorded or live, is not being as effective as expected, then other instruction options must be discussed. If data shows a new instruction options are effective, these options must be implemented in the student's IEP during an ARD meeting. These could include things like visual aids, technology integration, or even hands-on project development. The last area in the components of progress monitoring is feedback. Monitoring progress is a core instructional practice that includes formative assessment, questioning, and then providing feedback. Progress monitoring provides feedback information and data to share with the student, report to the parents, and to discuss in ARD meetings. The rigor of assignments should be linked to PLAF data, goals, and objectives in the student's IEPs. Feedback can be given in writing, virtually, face-to-face while reviewing assignments, and with the whole group. Parents and students should also be involved in this area. Feedback provided by parents and students can assist in providing the most appropriate form of instruction and assist in measuring progress. This next slide highlights feedback again, but specifically during remote learning. Again, there's no difference between progress monitoring and remote and face-to-face instruction when gathering or providing feedback. The process for progress monitoring in both face-to-face and remote learning is the same. However, the method may be different. Providing students with targeted and meaningful feedback is critically important. It helps to hold students accountable. It makes them realize you care about their progress and provides them with actionable steps on how to develop their skills. During remote instruction, this is very important as it also impacts the student's motivation to work and interact. Feedback can be immediately delivered via email, chat and notes, and through assignments and assessment reporting. Feedback for progress monitoring should come from the teacher providing instruction, the student, and the parent. Feedback from student and families is informative and provides new insight. So, how is progress monitoring during traditional face-to-face instruction change when remote learning must be implemented? It is important to understand that during remote learning, progress monitoring will continue. The purpose basically remains the same: to monitor improvement and to identify those students that are not making progress. During remote instruction, we must monitor whether virtual instruction is the best method of delivery. Progress monitoring will provide us the data to determine this. If virtual instruction is not effective, other options can be considered. Teachers can shift to tangible assistance, phone instruction, or from small group to individual, or from recorded instruction to live instruction. The focus remains the same as well. Instruction will be provided according to the IEP. An important step is documentation. The delivery routes of instruction and the student's performance must be documented. One key addition to this is communication. We communicated with our parents during face-to-face instruction in the remote environment. Communication will now increase and involve different discussions. Parents should be a part of progress monitoring. They can inform on effort, successes, and challenges. Now, we cannot mandate the parents to be involved in this progress monitoring process, but we can provide them the opportunity to do so. And the third point is tools. The methods of delivery, monitoring forms, and assessment may have to look different than in face-to-face instruction. Virtually recorded instruction, live virtual instruction, small group virtual instruction, individual virtual instruction, telephone, email, and tangible packets are all options that can now be utilized. Whatever methods are utilized, a monitoring form should be used to document instruction and progress. The types of assessments that can be used to measure progress in a remote environment are the same as the ones used in face-to-face environment, brief and administered at regular intervals. So, progress monitoring data collection options. So from the components of progress monitoring, we can see that documentation is very important. So how can data be gathered during remote learning? Many platforms that are used for home learning have progress monitoring data collection tools. Some of these applications can show how many hours the student is engaged in learning and where the student may need more instruction. These valuable tools can gauge how student learning is learning very quickly. In the first area, assessing students during virtual instruction times, say when you meet with them via Zoom, and during these virtual meetings, students complete sections of their works with the teachers, and teachers collect data as a student performs the task. Just make sure that your instructional time is that, instructional. We don't want to only assess and then not teach. LEAs may ask parents and guardians to track student on packets and other assignments. For example, teachers may ask parents to report which problems were completed independently by their child. Teachers can then see which problems were completed independently and then assume that the parents offered some sort of assistance or prompting on other questions. This could be applied to virtual platforms to gather data about how many hours a student is engaged in learning and where they might be struggling based on questions answered correctly or incorrectly. Teachers can then enter data as they otherwise would on a data sheet, noting the number of problems completed independently and accurately. A paraprofessional may also collect data during remote instruction. During these virtual meetings, students complete assigned tasks or assignments with the paraprofessional, and the paraprofessional collects data. The paraprofessional sends this data to the teachers on a scheduled basis, for example, once a week. Teaching students to self-monitor can be a valuable tool. For example, if you assign them to read one book per day at their reading level, the student can be in charge of checking off that they completed the book. As students learn to self-monitor her, perhaps teachers can also ask a parent or guardian to sign off too. A reminder, students and parents cannot be required to conduct progress monitoring. This would be the LEA's responsibility. So who should be involved in progress monitoring? Collaboration and participation from special education teachers, related service providers, the student, and the general education teacher is important. The roles of each are specific and informative. The special education teacher provides documentation of the instruction and accommodations provided and the student's progress toward the academic goals. The general education teacher, if the student has inclusion services, provides feedback on progress towards concept understanding and mastery. Related service providers provide an overview in student progress toward goal attainment in their field of specialty. Students can be taught to monitor their own progress and needs. The information gathered from the students themselves can be beneficial in planning instruction toward their goals and provide ownership of their progress. In a remote learning environment, the parent role in progress monitoring can be a vital one. Parents can give feedback on progress of their child that can be attributed toward progress monitoring documentation. Parent feedback can be taken through informal interviews or discussions, or even through progress monitoring tools or forms that are given to a parent. It's important to note that parents can be provided with progress monitoring tools to complete and or discuss during parent and teacher conferences. And parents can be asked to participate in progress monitoring, but is not a mandate or required. Teachers may ask for support from parents. However, parents cannot be required to conduct progress monitoring. Again, it's the LEA's responsibility. IEP documentation during remote learning. As you can see from our previous slide, progress monitoring during remote instruction involves participation from the same people as progress monitoring during face-to-face instruction. So, are there differences between remote and face-to-face documentation protocol? Well, both involve the review of assessment performance. The goals and objectives implementation is present in both environments, and progress is reported at the same intervals. The only difference identified between face-to-face and remote learning is the environment in which the instruction takes place. During face-to-face environment instruction, in a classroom versus the virtual or remote environment. Even though the environment is different in the virtual or remote environment, special education services are still required to be documented by special education staff who implement these services outside of the whole or virtual remote classroom instruction. Even though the environment is different, the documentation of IEP implementation is still the responsibility of special education staff, even in a virtual inclusion setting. The local education agency's responsibility. Now let's look at the responsibilities of the LEA regarding progress monitoring and remote learning. One important responsibility is that the LEA should have clearly defined operating procedures for progress monitoring during remote learning. Included in these procedures should be identified methods and timeframes of data collection. A second important responsibility of LEAs is to have a developed training for school staff that is ready to be delivered. And the third important responsibility is the LEA should provide support and guidance to school staff and parents regarding progress monitoring throughout remote learning. Progress monitoring best practices. Reviewing the best practices for progress monitoring during remote learning can assist LEAs in meeting the responsibilities identified. First, scheduling and collaborative planning. Best practices involve intentionally in scheduling and setting clear expectations for all relevant staff. This means general education teachers, ESL teachers, special education teachers, and instructional related service providers to have regularly scheduled document planning time together in a virtual setting. Next, develop processes and training for staff to guide their completion of the documents that typically require progress monitoring data, such as writing all components of draft IEPs, like PLAF goals, accommodations, etc., for upcoming admission review and dismissal meetings or ARD meetings, or even reevaluations. Next, develop data collection systems. This will involve preparing student progress reports for parents as documented in the IEP. It is also important to track service delivery times, which can be used as documentation for future compensatory discussions that might be necessary. Establish family communication. Schools should document communication with families about academic expectations and academic, behavioral, and IEP specific goals and progress monitoring systems. Families can be a wealth of information regarding a student's progress or lack of progress during virtual learning. Next, provide teachers with a template and frequency expectations. Develop a template and frequency protocol and train staff in how to use that protocol for documenting IEP goal progress, accommodations, and specifically designed instruction by the general education teacher, special education teacher, paraprofessional, and or the related services and speech providers. Next, make sure to provide teachers access to the IEP documents. This is vital to student and teacher success during remote learning. Ensure teachers have continued access to and are knowledgeable about their students' IEP documents, such as goals, objectives, accommodations, modifications, behavior plans, and supplements while working remotely. Next, ensure availability. Schools need to ensure teachers are providing families with office hours and tutoring availability. And finally, prepare contingency plans. These plans are a management tool used to analyze the impact of potential crises and ensure that adequate and appropriate arrangements are made in advance to respond in a timely manner, an effective and appropriate way to the educational needs of a student with disabilities when the school shifts from face-to-face to remote learning. Next, here's an example of a parent or family progress monitoring tool. This can be found on the TEA website. The family check-in form from TEA can be a great tool to gather progress monitoring information. But again, your school or LEA may already have their own. If parents or families are involved in progress monitoring, support can be provided by identifying goals that can be met at home, ensuring the goals are written in parent-friendly language, and working with the parent on when and how to progress monitor. Teachers, again, may ask for support from parents. However, parents cannot be required to conduct the progress monitoring. It's the LEA's responsibility. Resources available to families during remote learning. While providing families with support, we need to consider resources available to families. It's important to discuss and identify if families have access to Wi-Fi and a computer. If not, do they have a car to pick up the materials from school? Do they have access to a mailbox? How will the school get these resources to families in an efficient way? And who is responsible for doing this? These are considerations the LEA needs to address, as each community has different barriers and advantages. It is essential that we know our students and communicate with their families on a frequent basis. For more information, you can contact the Special Education Special Projects and Strategy Division. Thank you so much for your time and listening to this guidance on progress monitoring during remote learning. You can visit the TEA website at tea.gov/TexasSped, and you may also contact us at sped@tea.texas.gov with any questions or comments. More information about special education for LEAs and families can be found at spedtex.org. And finally, for more information and guidance on COVID-19, this can be found on the TEA website. Thanks so much.